Only 5 minutes have passed since an unofficial but earth-shattering communiqué from Kensington Palace rocked international headlines. While the world remains spiraling in speculation regarding Princess Kate's health, another media bombshell has just exploded. Prince William, a man known for his ironclad composure in the face of any storm, has officially broken his silence. But this time, the subject isn't the rumors surrounding his wife. It is an event the palace has desperately struggled to conceal for the past 48 hours. Harry's secret return to London. The atmosphere in London this morning is anything but peaceful, despite outward appearances. Dark-tinted vehicles, frantic phone calls between high-level advisors, and an extreme tension have blanketed every corner of the palace. It all began when a private jet touched down at an airfield north of London at midnight. No press greeting, no red carpet, and absolutely no confirmation from royal communications. Harry has returned, not as a son returning home, but as a ghost of the past appearing at the very moment the monarchy is at its most fragile state. Why has Harry returned at this exact moment? Why did the palace go to such lengths to hide his movements? The answer lies in a truth William was just forced to admit to close reporters. It is time the mask falls. William's long silence was not a sign of weakness, but a strategy to protect the final stability of his family. However, as medical leaks began to spiral out of control and Harry attempted to gain access to confidential files regarding Kate, William realized he could no longer retreat. This is no longer the emotional family reunion the public might imagine. This is a direct confrontation between an heir carrying the weight of the institution on his shoulders and an exiled brother seeking redemption, or perhaps one last chance at influence. William stood there, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights by his wife's bedside, his voice raspy but firm, declaring, "The monarchy is not a stage for personal dramas while a princess fights for her life." Harry's arrival has triggered the highest level of security protocols. Internal sources report that William has ordered Harry be barred from private family areas at Windsor. This is not just about privacy. It is about the safety of the institution. As the cracks in the ancient castle walls become clear, William did not choose to hang more beautiful paintings to hide them. He chose to look directly at the fracture and say, "Enough! This battle is not just occurring behind cold stone walls. It is unfolding in every headline, in every tweet, and in the hearts of millions of taxpayers who fund this institution." William knows that if he does not speak now, the truth will be distorted by media machines across the ocean. And tonight, as darkness falls over London, the world holds its breath to see if this broken silence leads to healing, or if it is the final shot in a brotherhood that has run completely out of trust. The tension reached its breaking point when reports surfaced of a heated standoff near the private wing of the hospital. Prince Harry's unexpected arrival was not greeted with the usual royal hospitality, but with a wall of security that sent a clear message. The inner sanctum was closed. William's decision to implement a Windsor Lockdown was a tactical move to prevent the narrative from being hijacked by outside influences. This wasn't just about security. It was about the palace machine struggling to maintain reality itself against a surge of internal leaks. William reportedly issued a direct order that Harry was not to be left alone with any medical staff or confidential files. Witnesses described a visibly shaken William confronting Harry's advisors, demanding to know why the visit wasn't coordinated through official channels. Harry's attempt to bypass the senior royal aides was seen by William as a calculated move to humanize his own image at the expense of Kate's privacy. Inside the gates, the battle over information intensified, with William arguing that privacy was no longer a luxury, but a survival mechanism for the monarchy. William's icy demeanor during this crisis reflects a deeper institutional fear that the crown is losing its grip on the story. He watched the pattern of fragile institutions that fear the truth more than the scandal, and he decided to stop the bleeding. The palace has always been a stage where the background must remain perfect, but Harry's presence threatened to pull back the curtain and expose the gears grinding within. In a chilling exchange overheard by staff, William allegedly told his brother that silence in a family is one thing, but silence in a public institution is another. He made it clear that while Harry may be a brother by blood, he is now an outsider to the firm that must protect the future king and queen. The emotional center of the monarchy, Princess Kate, is currently too fragile to be used as a pawn in a transatlantic PR war. As the hospital lights flickered in the London rain, the world realized that the fairy tale was officially dead. The monarchy was being forced to admit it can bleed, and William was the one standing over the wound, refusing to let anyone else touch it. This wasn't an update on health. It was a confession of a system reaching its breaking point. The atmosphere inside the palace turned even more frigid when a series of intercepted emails revealed Harry's attempts to communicate directly with Kate's medical team. William viewed this not as an act of concern, but as a severe violation of the zero transparency policy he had fought so hard to maintain. The Prince of Wales reportedly told his inner circle that the monarchy cannot survive if its internal vulnerabilities are being mined for a foreign media narrative. This wasn't just a family disagreement. It was a high-stakes battle over who gets to own the story of the crown's future. King Charles, caught between his son's aggression and his heir's fury, was forced to step in with a historic ultimatum. Witnesses claim the king stood side by side with William, finally admitting that the secrecy surrounding Kate's condition had reached its breaking point. Charles made it clear that while Harry remained a son, the protocols of the institution would now be enforced with ruthless precision. The king reportedly told Harry that privacy is the only currency we have left, effectively cutting off his brother from any further updates that were not released to the general public. This moment marked the end of the palace's attempt to manage optics through polite silence. William insisted that if the monarchy was to survive this crisis, it had to stop pretending that nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. The heir to the throne was no longer interested in protecting the fairy tale image. He was now focused on institutional survival at all costs. Harry's presence had served as the ultimate catalyst, forcing the palace machine to finally drop the guard it had held for decades. As the day progressed, the Windsor Lockdown was formalized into a new set of contingency plans for the future Queen's recovery. Every staff member was reminded that silence in a family is one thing, but silence in a public institution is another. William's icy focus was a warning to everyone inside the gates. The crown belongs to those who defend it, not those who seek to profit from its cracks. The world watched as the royal family turned on its own, realizing that the system had finally been forced to admit it could bleed. The shadow over the palace deepened when an internal memo, reportedly authored by a senior royal advisor, was leaked to a major news outlet. The memo, titled "She Deserves More Than Silence," exposed a deep and bitter conflict between Prince William's protective secrecy and the institution's need for public reassurance. William viewed the leak as a targeted attack on his leadership, a truth dragged out at the last possible moment that threatened to dismantle his carefully constructed wall of privacy. This wasn't just a security breach. It was a psychological war intended to force the palace to drop the mask it had worn for months. As the world parsed every word of the leaked document, William's icy resolve only hardened into a zero transparency policy. He realized that the monarchy was being tested by its own human frailty, and he refused to let the narrative be owned by anyone but the crown. The Prince of Wales reportedly gathered his legal team, insisting that silence in a public institution is a survival mechanism when the emotional center of the family, Princess Kate, is under threat. He was no longer just managing a health crisis. He was managing the perception of a dynasty that was beginning to bleed in real time. Inside the hospital, Harry's presence continued to act as a catalyst for chaos, forcing the palace machine to reach its breaking point. William allegedly accused his brother of feeding the very media machines that were now tearing at the family's private life. The confrontation grew so intense that staff reported a marked shift in the palace's energy. Tense, urgent, and dangerously off balance. William made it clear that you don't keep canceling a future king's schedule for nothing, and he would not allow the princess's recovery to be turned into a spectacle for foreign profit. As the rain continued to fall over London, the palace was forced to realize that the fairy tale could no longer be maintained. The gears within the ancient institution were grinding, worn down by months of secrecy and a missing princess. William stood at the center of the storm, a man who had watched fragile institutions fail when they feared truth more than scandal, and he was determined to be the one to rewrite the script. The world watched, realizing that this wasn't just a health update. It was a confession of a system struggling to survive its own humanity. The Windsor Lockdown reached a fever pitch as Prince William realized that the palace's wall of silence was finally crumbling under the weight of global obsession. Witnesses inside the gates described a chilling moment where the Prince of Wales, visibly shaken by the constant stream of leaks, reportedly declared that the monarchy had reached its breaking point. This wasn't just about managing optics anymore. It was about the survival of a system that was more afraid of the truth than of the scandal itself. William stood at the center of a house divided, realizing that the fairy tale he had spent his life protecting was being devoured from within by a missing princess and an exiled brother. Inside the London hospital, the atmosphere was thick with a marked shift in energy, tense, urgent, and dangerously off balance. Harry's attempt to gain unauthorized access to Kate's medical files was seen by William as the ultimate betrayal, a calculated move to humanize his own image at the cost of the crown's most vulnerable secrets. The confrontation between the brothers was reportedly so intense that staff could hear the gears of the ancient institution grinding to a halt. William made it clear that while Harry might be family, the firm belongs to those who defend its privacy, not those who treat it as a commodity for foreign media. King Charles, forced by the chaos to take a stand, finally backed his heir in a move that dropped the mask of the fairy tale monarchy. The king reportedly told his inner circle that privacy is the only currency we have left, effectively cutting Harry off from the institutional narrative. This wasn't transparency. It was a truth dragged out at the last possible moment because the king and his heir had no other choice. They realized that the world wasn't just watching a health update. They were watching an ancient system finally admit that it could bleed. As the hospital lights flickered through the London rain, the palace machine was forced into a state of zero transparency to prevent the story from being owned by outsiders. William insisted that if the monarchy wanted to survive, it could no longer go back to pretending that nothing ever breaks behind those cold stone walls. The Prince of Wales was no longer interested in protecting an image. He was now focused on a pushback that was human, honest, and ruthless in its precision. The world watched as the royal family reached its breaking point, realizing that the emotional center of the monarchy, Princess Kate, had become the ultimate test case for the institution's survival. The gears of the ancient institution continued to grind as Prince William was forced into a moment of honest vulnerability that the palace machine had tried to prevent for months. He realized that you don't keep canceling a future king's schedule for nothing, and the world was beginning to see the cracks he had fought so hard to hide. This wasn't transparency. It was truth dragged out at the last possible moment because the walls of secrecy had finally reached their breaking point. William stood at the center of the storm, realizing that the monarchy doesn't just manage feelings, it manages perception, and that is exactly where the crisis began. As the hospital lights flickered in the London rain, the Prince of Wales reportedly admitted to his inner circle that the palace always wanted to keep the stage background perfect. However, Princess Kate's illness had become the moment the backstage curtain was pulled back, revealing a system that was more afraid of the truth than of the scandal itself. This was no longer about managing optics or royal theater. It was a confession that even a 1,000-year-old institution can bleed when its emotional center is under threat. William's icy focus was a survival mechanism, a desperate pushback against a reality that was slipping away. Inside the palace, the atmosphere remained tense and dangerously off balance as the Windsor Lockdown intensified. Every staff member felt the weight of the silence, a silence that in a public institution is far more dangerous than any headline. William insisted that if the monarchy wanted to survive in a world that watched Kate suffer in real time, it could no longer pretend that nothing ever breaks behind those cold stone walls. This was the night the palace blinked, realizing that humanity and vulnerability were the only tools left to save the crown from its own secrets. The confrontation with Harry had left the gears of the institution worn down and grinding, but it also forced a reset that the palace machine never could have planned. William realized that Kate had given them what the system never could, a raw, human vulnerability that cut through all the palace spin. This wasn't a routine health update. It was a turning point where the monarchy was forced to admit it is mortal. The world watched as the royal family reached its breaking point, waiting to see if a system built on secrecy could ever truly adapt to human frailty. The Windsor Lockdown was no longer just a defensive maneuver. It became the foundation for a total reset of the monarchy's script. Prince William realized that the palace machine, in its obsession with maintaining a perfect stage background, had nearly destroyed the institution's remaining credibility. He understood that you don't keep canceling a future king's schedule for nothing, and the world was now demanding more than just polished palace lines. This was the moment William decided that the crown must stop managing perceptions and start embracing a pushback rooted in honest vulnerability. The Prince of Wales reportedly sat with his top advisors, insisting that silence in a public institution is a poison that allows leaks and rumors to fester. He realized that the monarchy doesn't just manage feelings, it manages the very reality of the nation, and that reality was currently breaking behind palace walls. This wasn't transparency for the sake of the press. It was a survival mechanism to ensure that the emotional center of the monarchy, Princess Kate, was not lost to the gears of a cold, unfeeling machine. Inside the London hospital, the atmosphere remained tense as the gears of the institution continued to grind, but a new protocol was emerging. William was no longer hiding behind privacy as a shield to delay unpleasant truths. He was using it to create a space where humanity could exist apart from the royal theater. He realized that if the monarchy wanted to survive, it had to admit it could bleed and that its members were as mortal as the people they served. The night the palace blinked was the night it finally admitted that the fairy tale image was a liability in a world that watched Kate suffer in real time. Every decision made during this crisis was now focused on a contingency plan for a future where a queen might have to step away just to survive. William's icy focus had transformed into a protective wall, but this time, it was built on a foundation of truth dragged out at the last possible moment, ensuring the crown would never be the same again. The gears of the ancient institution were now grinding against the raw reality of human emotion. Prince William realized that the palace machine had reached its breaking point, and he could no longer allow the firm to manage perceptions at the cost of his wife's dignity. He insisted that silence in a public institution is a far more dangerous poison than any headline, especially when the emotional center of the monarchy, Princess Kate, was being used as a pawn in an internal battle for control. This wasn't just about royal theater. It was a desperate pushback against a system that was more afraid of the truth than of the tragedy unfolding behind its cold stone walls. William reportedly gathered his inner circle, his voice raspy but firm, declaring that privacy is not a luxury, it is a survival mechanism. He was no longer willing to protect a fairy tale image that required his wife to suffer in real time for the sake of royal protocol. He realized that Kate had given the world what the palace machine never could, an honest vulnerability that cut through decades of polished spin. As the hospital lights flickered through the London rain, William made it clear that the crown must admit it can bleed, or it will eventually shatter under the weight of its own secrets. Inside the palace, the atmosphere remained dangerously off balance as the king and his heir stood side by side, finally telling the world that the situation was far more serious than they had ever allowed the cameras to see. This wasn't transparency. It was truth dragged out at the last possible moment because the walls of secrecy had reached their breaking point. William's icy focus was now directed at those within the institution who sought to manage reality itself, warning them that you don't keep canceling a future king's schedule for nothing. As the day came to an end, the Windsor Lockdown was no longer just about guarding gates. It was about guarding the soul of a woman who had reset the monarchy's script. William understood that if the monarchy wanted to survive in the 21st century, it could no longer go back to pretending that nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. He was prepared to let the mask fall completely, realizing that a system forced to admit its own mortality is the only one that has a chance at redemption. The Windsor Lockdown has evolved from a temporary security measure into a full-scale constitutional pivot. Prince William realized that the palace machine, in its desperate attempt to maintain a perfect stage background, had accidentally created a power vacuum that outsiders were eager to fill. He understood that you don't keep canceling a future king's schedule for nothing, and the world was starting to suspect that the gears of the monarchy were no longer turning in unison. This wasn't just a family dispute. It was a moment where the king and his heir had to decide if the institution was strong enough to survive the honesty of its own frailty. William reportedly held a high-level briefing with constitutional advisors. His icy focus settled on one objective: institutional survival. He argued that silence in a public institution is a far more dangerous poison than any headline, as it breeds the very leaks and rumors that were now tearing at the Crown's credibility. The Prince of Wales insisted that the monarchy must stop managing perceptions through secrecy and start leading through a pushback that is human, raw, and undeniably real. He was prepared to let the world see the cracks, realizing that a missing princess and a fractured brotherhood had already pulled back the curtain on the royal theater. Inside the palace, the atmosphere remained tense as the gears of the system were forced to adapt to a new reality where Princess Kate was the primary driver of the monarchy's future relevance. Every staff member realized that the firm was no longer a cold, unfeeling machine, but a family fighting for its life in the glare of a global spotlight. William made it clear that privacy is not a luxury, it is a survival mechanism, and he would not allow the institution to sacrifice the mother of his children for the sake of outdated protocols. As the London rain washed over the ancient stone walls, the palace blinked and finally admitted that the fairy tale was over. This wasn't a PR slip or a moment of accidental transparency. It was truth dragged out at the last possible moment because the walls of secrecy had reached their breaking point. William stood at the helm of a system that had finally been forced to admit it could bleed, realizing that the only way to save the crown was to stop pretending it was invincible. The world watched, sensing that the shift in power from the machine to the human was now irreversible. The Windsor Lockdown reached its ultimate conclusion not with a public reconciliation, but with a definitive and cold restructuring of the royal hierarchy. Prince William realized that the palace machine had finally finished its most painful transformation, moving from an era of never complain, never explain to a new doctrine of ruthless protection of the core. He understood that you don't keep canceling a future king's schedule for nothing, and the world now stood witness to a monarchy that had survived its own internal collapse. This wasn't just the end of a health crisis. It was the birth of a more hardened, human, and defensive Vong Tru. Inside the palace, the atmosphere of marked shift in energy, tense, urgent, and dangerously off-balance, finally began to stabilize, but at a tremendous emotional cost. Harry's departure from London was as silent and shadowed as his arrival, leaving behind a brother who had reset the monarchy's script in his absence. William reportedly told his inner circle that silence in a public institution is a choice, and we have chosen a silence that protects rather than a silence that hides. The Prince of Wales was no longer interested in managing the fairy tale. He was now the architect of a system that prioritized the recovery of the future queen over the optics of the global press. King Charles, standing in the shadows of the Great Hall, finally acknowledged that the firm had been forced to admit it could bleed. The mask of invincibility had fallen, and in its place was a truth dragged out at the last possible moment: that the crown is only as strong as the people who wear it. This wasn't transparency for the sake of public gossip. It was a survival mechanism that ensured the institution would not be devoured by its own secrets. William made it clear that privacy is the only currency we have left, and he had spent it all to buy Kate the peace she needed to fight her battle in the shadows. As the London rain finally cleared, the world looked at a monarchy that was fundamentally changed. The emotional center, Princess Kate, remained hidden, but the pushback from the palace had been successful in reclaiming the narrative. William had watched fragile institutions fail when they feared truth more than scandal, and he had vowed that his Vong Tru would not be one of them. The world watched, realizing that while the fairy tale was dead, the reality was far more compelling. A family that had reached its breaking point and chose to survive as humans, not just symbols.